This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video is part 1 of our initial exploration of Seminar 5. Seminar 5, the most monumental seminar yet, in my view, integrates previous topics in a systematic manner through the use of the graph of desire. This graph reworks the schema L, surpassing its limitations and incorporating the rich complexity of Lacan's theorizing. This seminar also clarifies ongoing questions and confusion that I had remaining from previous seminars, such as the distinction between the ego ideal and superego, the differences between hysterics and obsessionals, the relationship between the name of the father and phallus, and more. Previously, I covered the first 3 seminars in sequential order, with a summarizing video at the end upon completing this seminar. For Seminar 4, I proceeded in a manner organized by topics rather than unpacking lectures sequentially, especially in the last 3 videos. As a result, I dedicated far fewer videos to Seminar 4 and did not create a summarizing video, at least not yet. For Seminar 5, what I'll be doing is presenting a summary of the entire seminar in the first few videos, which will be somewhere around 3 or 4, instead of waiting until the end. This will then be followed by shorter, more focused videos that will provide a detailed analysis of individual lectures. This approach will hopefully cater to both those who enjoy close textual analysis and those who are new to Lacan and would benefit from a more broader overview before diving into the details. These initial summary videos for Seminar 5 will focus on the graph of desire, starting with the relationship between need and demand and the dialectic of desire and demand. Since presenting Lacan's thought in a linear manner is never possible, some related concepts will be covered in later videos. For instance, today's video will not delve into the formulas of desire, which will require first addressing what Lacan has to say about the phallus and ego ideal, which we'll do in a subsequent video. So we're going to be diving deep into the complex world of Lacan's graph of desire, which isn't really one graph at all, but a series of constantly evolving ones. Each one serves a specific purpose, and the final version wasn't even presented until several years after Seminar 5. So if you've already been familiar with the graph of desire, you want to brace yourself for some differences and discrepancies that you might find in this video with what you already know about it. For an in-depth look at the final version, I'd recommend checking out the excellent video entitled A Tour of Lacan's Graph of Desire on the YouTube channel Lacan Online. What is a need? At first, it might seem like something rooted in instinct in nature. The things we need for our physical survival, like water and food, come to mind rather easily. But then there are other things we call needs, but aren't essential for survival, like sex and love. The human subject, Lacan argues, doesn't have access to any pure animalistic needs. Sure, there are needs and they're tied to animal instincts, but let's think about what sets the human animal apart. Humans are born prematurely, exhibiting a greater dependence on others than any other animal, really. When an infant has a need, it cries. But the caregiver can't always immediately understand what the cry means. They have to interpret it through language, which turns the baby's unspoken need into words. Over time, the child learns to communicate their needs through these words as well. The only way we can come to understand and communicate our needs is through these words. So when my son is getting upset and throwing a toy around or screaming, I might say to my son, use your words. And when he can't find the right combination of words, I try to help him express those needs in words that are my own that I am attempting to furnish for him. But, Lacan argues, something happens here in the process of communicating needs through language. Needs become demands. And it should be noted that in French, demande, or demander has a bit of a softer meaning, having the sense of making a request, soliciting, or even simply asking for something. However, Lacan suggests in this seminar that the English sense of demand is closer to what he means. So it should have this intensity or sharpness to it as when a child demands for its bottle or a toy. And so demand comes into play when our needs are communicated through signifiers spoken to another. But here I said signifiers instead of just language. And that's because when we express our needs, there is a gap between the words we use and the meaning of those words. Perhaps we all can relate to this. I imagine we've all experienced a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of our needs at some point, whether it's the other doing the misunderstanding or even by ourselves. How often have we asked for one thing when in fact we actually wanted something else but didn't realize it until afterwards? That's because the words, and I'm not just referring to words, but the signifiers more specifically, that we use to express our needs were given to us from others, mainly from our primary caregivers. And no matter how well intentioned these caregivers were, there's always some degree of missing the mark, that the signifier does not always land exactly on the signified. There's some slippage. So signifiers not only change the way our needs are expressed, but they also change the actual meaning of those needs. Our needs are no longer just tied to basic physical necessities like food, water, and warmth. They have an indefiniteness about them because they're often not tied to any specific object at all, at least not at first. The demand for love is exemplary here. The demand for love not only is added on top of the demands for physical sustenance, but it surpasses them to the point that all demands become fundamentally a demand for love. But the catch is that love is not a tangible object, making it impossible to truly satisfy. That's why the demand for love is something inherently excessive and insatiable. As Lacan states, it's not for nothing that children ask for the moon. They ask for it because it's in the nature of a need expressed via a signifying system. Now, not only does need get transformed in passing through the mediation of signifiers, but this demand for love itself is often disguised. So we don't always ask for love directly, but instead request something else that we hope will offer a substitute satisfaction. This happens because a demand has to take into account the laws and restrictions in the symbolic system of the other who is receiving this communication. So if a direct demand is not allowed for some reason, we'll make a substitute request. For example, instead of asking for love, we may ask for a home-cooked meal, a day off from work to spend time with someone, or a demand to sit down and watch a telenovela show together instead of going up to one's office and work on a script for a YouTube video, just to name a few non-specific examples. Since need is reconfigured by the signifiers that one receives from another, and one makes demands in a manner that takes into account the other, there is always a remainder or residue that gets left unsaid and unsatisfied. For this reason, there is inherently a kind of dissatisfaction that comes with demand, and this dissatisfied something takes on a life of its own outside the constraints of demand, a kind of beyond of demand. And this notion of the beyond will be very important throughout this seminar. So you may ask yourself if you've ever felt like something is missing even after you get what you've asked for. I had the experience fairly recently. For years I was trying to write a book, but always there were barriers that got in the way, perhaps many of them put up there by myself, unbeknown to me. In this instance, I made a demand to write a book, a demand I made to myself. And we can, of course, ask whether it was really me who was demanding it. But then it finally happened. I wrote and published a book. And guess what? It didn't quite feel like I thought it would. It wasn't devastating or anything like that, but I barely derived much satisfaction when it finally happened. Perhaps a little relief at no longer having the weight of that demand on me. But at the same time, what happened is that I acquired new demands to fixate upon. Sometimes this does happen in a manner that can be devastating, and it's for this reason it's sometimes said that one of the worst things that can happen to you is getting what you ask for. These cases demonstrate how in demand, there's always something left unsaid and unfulfilled. Because our needs are reconfigured by the signifiers we receive from others, and communicating them means that they are once again shaped by the symbolic system of the other, our demands always leave a residue of dissatisfaction that comes to take a life of its own beyond the constraints of demand. This residue or reminder is what Lacan calls desire. Desire is neither need nor demand, but is the difference between the two. It's called by Lacan the absolute form of need, something that lies beyond the unconditional demand for love. Demand partially articulates a modified need, but leaves much more unsaid. And it's in the margins between the demand for satisfaction of needs and the demand for love wherein desire is produced. However, despite what it might sound like, desire is not some pure form of need, untainted by demand. We can't forget that our needs are always already structured by signifiers from the very beginning. But for these signifiers to be brought into speech as a demand, they have to undergo another modification to be spoken and linked up to specific meanings. And because this speech has to take into account the symbolic system of the other, what gets left out of demand is often what is fundamentally prohibited from being spoken. This prohibition of signifiers is a critical feature for not only how desire gets separated off from demand, but also how, in turn, this desire becomes unconscious desire, that is repressed. So desire is not just a personal want, but because it's always already caught up and structured by signifiers, one's desire is intertwined with the desires of others. But since desire is defined here as lack, what the subject desires in the other is to become or have what the other lacks. And it's this lack in the other that opens a whole field that must be considered, leading us to what is called the other of the other. So now let's situate all this within the graph of desire to make better sense of this dialectic of desire and demand. Again, much more needs to be said, particularly of how desire is drained and filtered back into demand, but we'll get there in a later video. The lines that concern us here first are on the bottom half of the graph. The curved line resembling an upside-down U symbolizes in part the speaking subject, the one who communicates their needs as concrete demands. At the beginning, we see the subject of the statement, the speaker themselves. The horizontal line represents the signifying chain, and there are 2 points of intersection between these lines. The first intersection is where we find the symbolic mother, the first significant other in the child's life. This line represents the relationship between the child and mother, and more specifically, the child's demand for love. The mother then structures and reorganizes this demand, and this is the retroactive effect that happens at the level of the symbolic. And also recall that the child's first demand was already formulated by signifiers received through the mother. The location of the symbolic mother here is represented by A, which stands for the big other, who is the locus of signifiers, the source of symbolic code, and the treasure trove of received ideas and sentences. In passing through the code, the child's demand is structured, maintained, and retroactively gets formulated, being passed on to the other intersecting point of this graph, wherein we find what's called the message, sometimes symbolized by the letter gamma, before returning back to the mother. Now we'll see here at the point of the message a formula meaning the signified of the other. This is where a meaning is given to the child's demand after it has passed through the locus of signifiers, that is, the symbolic mother. The message is a point at which the signifier and signified get knotted together, and thus is what Lacan will identify here as a quilting point. But it's also always an alienated message, one subject to the capricious law of the mother, which the child is subject to and dependent upon. The line that returns from the message to the big other which the subject receives then as their own message, is an alienated message. Now, because the child's demand for love is not completely satisfied, and nor could it ever be, and it's predicated upon the capriciousness of the law of the mother, who is sometimes absent, sometimes present, who sometimes satisfies and sometimes refuses the demand, there opens up a gap here between the supposed imaginary satisfaction of need that is received through the alienated message, and there's always some degree of satisfaction when the signifier gets attached to the signified here. There's a gap between that and what the mother actually gives. And this gap produces the first recognition by the subject that the mother wants something else that is beyond the child. That beyond the mother's demands of the child is a desire in the mother. That she can't give what the child demands as well because she is beholden to this something else that she lacks. And in light of this realization, the child will seek out what it imagines the mother wants and to desire it as well, to desire even to become it by identifying with it. And herein is how the subject's desire becomes the desire of the other. But what does the mother want? What does she lack? This critical question leads to an initial search for some object that might provide an answer to those questions. Such an object is first discovered on the imaginary plane and becomes what the child seeks to identify with. It serves as the ideal ego and becomes thus a point of orientation around which the child will constitute its own image of itself in the form of what's called the ego. However, as we've discussed and as we'll return to again, this imaginary relation marks a misrecognition of desire, and the child, in passing through the Oedipus complex, will eventually have to give up becoming this object and to recognize that the mother's desire is located elsewhere, in a beyond of the mother who, as a lacking subject, is also subject to her own big other, the other of the other, the symbolic father. Consequently, the mother is beholden to a law that supersedes her own and through which her own desire is structured. And since all of this is in a certain sense approached from the location of the subject, this relation between the mother and the father, the mother's desire and the law of the father, will become inherited by the subject and function as a kind of unconditional repetitive insistence that, as a chain of signifiers, sets it apart from all that is brought into speech as demand, which itself is always formulated and structured by another. And so although desire is structured by signifiers, is attached to them, it's also in a way disconnected from a larger chain of signifiers that have been allowed to be expressed and spoken in the form of demand. And one of the aims of analysis is to find ways to bring that repressed part of the chain into some kind of verbal expression. But because this desire does not belong to the subject in some sort of pure natural state, but it's always the desire of the other, a desire that has infiltrated the subject from beyond, even from beyond the mother, and coming from the other of the other in the symbolic father. And it's for this reason Lacan states that your desire is always cuckolded, or rather, it's you who are cuckolded. You yourself are betrayed in that your desire has slept with signifiers. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can support this work as well by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. I'm excited to start Seminar 5 finally, and I'm looking forward to going in depth with the material that I think is very rich here. So as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.